They drove Suzu out of Bitter Springs at noon, with the whole town watching, and not one of them willing to say what they actually saw. She was a quiet Japanese woman who had spent a year tending their sick until a cattleman's wife died under her care, and the town decided a foreigner was easier to blame than a fact. They took the one thing that could have cleared her, a lacquered box her grandmother had carried from Kyoto, and they wouldn't let her open it. She walked into open country meaning to disappear, until she knocked on a door that should have stayed shut, and a rancher who hadn't spoken to another person in 6 years said the 4 words that broke her. Stand till the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways of Japan refused to run a second time, and how one open door unmade a whole town's lie. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The main street of Bitter Springs wasn't much more than 100 yards of packed dirt and warped lumber, but that day it felt like a mile. Suzu walked it from end to end with the whole town lined up to watch her go, and not one of them said a word to her face. They had plenty to say behind her back, and they said it loud enough to make sure she heard. Poisoner. That was the word they used now. She had been Suzu who kept the fever off the Morrison baby. Suzu who set Ed Harlan's broken arm so clean it healed straight. Suzu who sat up 2 nights with old Mrs. Pedersen when the rest of the town had already written the woman off. That Suzu was gone. In her place was a foreigner in a dust-coated kimono, walking out of a town that had decided what she was before anyone asked her a single question. The Caros were the reason. Walt Caro ran the biggest spread in the valley, and his wife Hetty had been the closest thing Bitter Springs had to a queen. 3 weeks ago Hetty took a fever. Suzu went to the Caro house to treat her, the way she had treated a dozen women in that town before. 3 days later, Hetty was dead, and Walt Caro stood up in the saloon and said the word that ended Suzu's life in Bitter Springs. Poison. He said a foreign woman with foreign herbs had killed his wife, and he said it loud enough that no one in that room was going to argue with the richest man in the valley. The sheriff was a man named Holt. Holt wasn't a bad man, but he was a small one and a job too big for him. He took Suzu's lacquered medicine box the same day Walt Caro made his claim. He said it was held for the judge, the way a man says a thing when he knows the thing is wrong but doesn't know how to stop it. Suzu asked for it back once, quiet, standing in the doorway of his office, with her hands flat at her sides. Holt shook his head. She didn't ask again, because asking twice would have looked like begging, and her grandmother had taught her that a healer doesn't beg. That box was the only thing her grandmother had carried out of Kyoto. Suzu's mother had died on the passage over, and her grandmother had raised her in a rented room above a laundry in San Francisco, training her hands on needles and herbs and a record book that went back 4 generations of women in their line. The box held the book. The book held the truth about Hetty Caro, written in Suzu's own hand the night she dressed the wound. Hetty made her swear not to mention. But the book was written in Japanese, and the judge was 3 weeks out, and Walt Caro wasn't waiting for any judge, so Suzu walked. A woman in front of the general store yanked her daughter back by the arm. When Suzu passed, as though the poison were a thing you could catch from a sleeve, a man near the far end of the street threw a clod of packed dirt that caught the hem of her kimono beneath her trail coat, and left a brown smear across the red silk. She didn't turn. She kept her shoulders level and her eyes on the road where it left the town and bent north into open country, because walking forward was the only dignity she had left, and she wasn't going to give it up for the satisfaction of looking back. The next settlement was 2 days' ride, and she was on foot. She didn't have a plan past the next hour. She had water in a canteen a man at the livery had filled for her without being asked, the only kindness she had been shown that day, and she had the needle roll she kept hidden inside her coat, the one the sheriff hadn't thought to look for. She had nothing else, and she walked anyway, because the alternative was standing still in a town that wanted her gone. And standing still had never been something her grandmother taught her to do. The road bent north, and the town fell behind her, and the wind came up and put a sound in the grass that was almost like the sea, and she walked into it. 2 days on the road turned her into a thing made of dust and will. The canteen ran dry by the end of the first day, and she filled it once from a creek that tasted of iron, and once from a rain barrel outside a line shack that had no one in it. She ate what she could find, which wasn't much, and by the morning of the second day her lips had cracked and her legs had started to feel like they belonged to someone else. The storm came in from the west around noon. It was a spring storm, the kind the territory threw up without warning, and it turned the sky the color of a bruise and put a cold wind in front of it that bent the grass flat. She saw a buckboard parked outside a fence line, half under a canvas lean-to, and she sheltered against it for a while until she understood the buckboard wasn't going to be enough. The rain was coming sideways. She looked along the fence and saw, maybe a quarter-mile off, the amber flicker of a kerosene lamp in a cabin window. She followed the fence. The lamp was the only steady thing in a world going gray and loud, and she fixed on it the way a person fixes on anything when there's nothing else. By the time she reached the gate, her coat was soaked through, and her hair had come loose from its pins and was stuck to her face, and she was shaking, but she was still walking, and she was still standing straight. The cabin was small and well kept, with a covered porch and a rail to tie horses to, and a barn behind it that was bigger than the cabin itself. She stood on the porch for a long moment before she knocked. She didn't knock the way a beggar knocks, fast and apologetic. She knocked once, clear, and waited. The door opened, and the man standing in it was bigger than she had expected, with a face that had gone hard from years of not being looked at and hands that hung at his sides like they were used to holding things heavier than a door. He didn't speak. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he has to decide about, and she let him look, because there was nothing she could say that would change what he was seeing. She asked for water one time and said she would go after. Her voice came out rough from 2 days of not using it, and the words sat between them in the lamplight. He looked at the dust-coated kimono under the soaked coat, and the cracked lips, and the way she held her shoulders even now, when most people would have been folded in on themselves. He had spent 6 years driving every living soul off this land, every hand who tried to hire on, every census taker, every neighbor who came up the drive to borrow a tool or welcome him to the country. The county called him the Hermit of Crow Creek, and he had earned the name and he had wanted it. He didn't know why he opened the door that night, and he wouldn't know for a long time after. He stepped back from the doorway. He didn't say come in, or sit down, or you look half dead. He said 4 words, slow, the way a man says a thing he has not said in years and isn't sure, still works. You can stay in the spare room. She wept. The word broke her before she could stop it. She hadn't wept in years, not since the morning her grandmother died in that room above the laundry, and Suzu had washed the body and folded the hands and locked the lacquered box and decided that grief was a thing she couldn't afford. She had held it down through the passage, through the loneliness of the frontier, through the year of being the foreign woman in a town that used her hands and mistrusted her face. She had held it down through the accusation and the dirt clod and the walk out. One sentence from a stranger broke it. A single tear tracked clean through the dust on her cheek, and then another, and she didn't wipe them because wiping them would have been the same as apologizing for them. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she was running from. He took the lamp off the hook by the door and walked her down the short hall to a room with a bed, a quilt, a chair, and a kerosene lamp of its own, and nothing else. He set the lamp on the chair and went back down the hall, and she heard the front door close. And then the lock turn, and then nothing. She stood in the middle of that room with the amber light jumping on the walls, and she understood that she had knocked on the wrong door, and that the wrong door was the first right thing that had happened to her in a month. She didn't take charity idly. That wasn't something her grandmother had taught her in words, but it was something Suzu had learned from watching the old woman work, the way a healer earns her place by making herself useful before anyone has to ask. By the second morning at Crow Creek, she was up before Tucker, and by the third, she had swept the cabin, mended a split in the porch rail, and found the tack room behind the barn in a state that made her hands itch. Tucker watched her move through his days, the way a man watches weather he doesn't trust yet. He didn't comment. He didn't thank her. He left her to it, and she left him to his silences, and they passed each other in the yard and the kitchen without more than a nod. For the first week, the medicine showed itself before anyone asked for it. Tucker had an old wound in his left shoulder, a bullet from a range fight 6 years back that the country doctor had left in because cutting it out was more likely to kill him than the ball itself. Most days it was a dull ache. He carried the way he carried everything, quietly and without complaint. On the third night, the weather turned cold, and the ache turned into something else, and he couldn't lift his arm high enough to hang the lamp on the hook by the door. Suzu heard him stop in the hall, heard the catch in his breathing, and she came out of the spare room without a word. She didn't ask permission in words. She went to her coat, where it hung drying by the stove, and took out the small cloth roll she had kept hidden inside the lining, the one the sheriff hadn't thought to look for. She unrolled it on the kitchen table, and inside were a set of needles so fine they caught almost no light from the lamp, each one seated in its own loop of cloth, tools her grandmother had used in Kyoto before Suzu was born. Tucker went still when he saw them. His good hand came up half an inch, the instinct of a man on a frontier who has learned to be careful of strange things in strange hands. She saw it, and she stopped, and she waited, the way she had waited at his door. She didn't explain what the needles were for. She let him look at her face and decide. After a long moment, he sat down at the table and turned his shoulder toward her. That was all the permission there was, and it was enough. She worked for maybe 20 minutes, her hands steady, her breathing even, and the only sound in the cabin was the rain starting up again on the roof. When she was done, he lifted his arm, slow, all the way to the hook, and hung the lamp. He stared at his own hand up there like it belonged to someone else. He slept through the night for the first time in years, and in the morning he looked at her across the kitchen table the way a man looks at a thing he has badly misjudged. Before he slept, she did one more thing. She asked for a pot and water and the few dried herbs she kept folded in paper at the bottom of her coat, things she had gathered outside Bitter Springs the summer before, and she brewed a short decoction over the stove, the way her grandmother had taught her to brew a Campo draft for a deep inflammation. Cabin filled with a bitter green smell that did not belong to any kitchen Tucker had ever known. She told him to drink it warm, all of it, and he did, and the ache in the shoulder went from a shout to a murmur by the second cup. It wasn't magic. It was the old way of working the body from the inside while the needles worked it from the out, and he had never seen a thing like it, and he did not have words for what he was watching. So he said nothing, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was recalculation. He had been wrong about her, and being wrong wasn't a thing that came easy to him. Later that day, she asked him for one thing. She asked if there was any way to get her box back, the lacquered one the sheriff had taken. Tucker asked her why it mattered so much, since she still had her needles. She said the needles were her hands, but the box was her grandmother's. and the book inside it was the only record of every person she had treated, including the woman who had died. He didn't push her past that. But he filed the box away somewhere behind his eyes, the way he filed fence lines and water rights, as a thing that now belonged on his list of problems. The box became a shared object between them. After that, a thing they both reached for in their heads, even when they didn't talk about it. And the silence in the cabin started to have a different shape to it, the shape of two people pointed at the same problem instead of two people pointed away from each other. 2 weeks in, Tucker rode down to Bitter Springs for supplies he couldn't put off any longer, salt and flour and a new lash for the well pump. He did it the way he did everything, fast and without chatting, in and out of the general store, before anyone could get a sentence going. But the clerk was a young man named Finn, who kept his eyes open, and Finn noticed the brand on the order and the amount of flour, which was twice what a man alone would buy. And Finn said something about it to the next customer who came in, and by sundown the whole town had a new thing to talk about. The Hermit of Crow Creek was buying for two. The Hermit of Crow Creek had a woman out there. Holt, the sheriff, rode up the drive the next evening just before dark. He was alone and he came without a warrant, which meant he came to talk rather than to act. And Suzu knew the difference because she had spent a year watching that town work. Tucker met him on the porch. Suzu stayed inside with the door open, a hand's width, and she heard all of it. Holt wasn't cruel about it. He said the woman Tucker was keeping was accused of poisoning Hetty Caro, that a circuit judge was coming through in 3 weeks, and that the Caros were making noise about Tucker's grazing lease on the county section if he didn't turn her over. He said it the way a man says a thing when he knows he's delivering a threat on someone else's behalf, and is a little ashamed of it. He gave Tucker a way out, the same way a man holds a door open for you to leave through. Tucker stood in the doorway and said nothing for a long beat. The lamp was lit behind him, and Holt's face in the light was the face of a man who wanted to be told what to do so he could go home. Tucker didn't tell him what to do. He told him one thing, flat. She stays. Fry? Holt left with the threat hanging in the air between them like smoke, and Suzu heard the hoofbeats go down the drive and then fade, and she stood in the hall with her hand on the wall and understood that her presence in this house was now going to cost this man something real. Something he could measure in land and money and the bad will of the most powerful family in the valley. That night she packed her needle roll and set it by the front door, and she wrote a note on the back of a feed sack tag, 3 lines in English, telling him she was going so his land would be safe, and thanking him for the spare room. She meant to leave before dawn. She got as far as the door. Tucker was sitting in the dark on the other side of it, in the chair by the cold stove, with no lamp lit. He had heard her moving. He didn't raise his voice. He told her plain that running a second time was the one thing that would make her look guilty to that judge, and that she knew it, that he wasn't going to watch her hand the Caros their verdict for free. She sat back down. She picked the needle roll up off the floor where she had set it, and she carried it back to the spare room, and she didn't sleep for a long time, because she understood now that staying was the harder thing, and he had just made her choose it, and that he had done it for her as much as for himself. The clock had started 3 weeks to the judge, and the box still in Holt's office, and the Carols between them and any kind of peace. They couldn't wait for the judge. That was the thing they both understood. By morning, without saying it, over coffee and the last of the flour. So Suzu did the thing she hadn't been able to do in Bitter Springs, the thing her grandmother's teaching had stopped her from doing even when it would have saved her. She told Tucker the truth. Hetty Caro's death wasn't poison. It was a wound, a cut on the inside of her arm, deep and ragged, and a week old, by the time she called Suzu to the house, and she made Suzu swear not to tell her husband where it came from. Suzu cleaned it, dressed it, told Hetty to rest and keep it dry, the way she had told 100 patients before. Hetty didn't rest. Hetty was a proud woman married to a hard man, and she went back to her work and her social calls with the cut still open, and by the time Suzu was called back, the infection had taken hold. 3 days later, Hetty was dead of a fever that started in that arm and ended in her blood, sepsis and not poison. The cut killed her, and the cut came from someone Hetty couldn't afford to name. Suzu could have said all of this in Bitter Springs. She could have stood up in the saloon and told Walt Caro that his wife had been seeing another man and had cut herself on something of his, and the town would have believed her, and the town would have hated her worse for it, because she would have been dragging a dead woman's name through the mud to save her own skin. Her grandmother had taught her that a healer holds the secrets of the living and the dead, and that holding them is the price of the work. So Suzu held it, and she let them call her a poisoner, and she walked out of town carrying a dead woman's secret on her back along with everything else. Tucker listened to all of this without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a while, the way he was quiet about everything, and then he asked her one question. He asked who Hetty was meeting. Suzu said she didn't know. She had never asked, and Hetty had never said. Tucker said he knew, or he knew how to find out, because there were only so many men in that valley with reason to meet a married woman in secret, and only one of them with reason to want the foreign healer gone before anyone looked too closely at a dead woman's arm. The box mattered now in a way it hadn't before. Inside the lacquered box was her grandmother's record book, the one that went back 4 generations, and in that book was the entry for Hetty Caro, written the night Suzu dressed the cut, in Suzu's own hand, in Japanese. The entry said exactly what Suzu had just told Tucker. It wasn't proof a Montana judge could read on his own, but it was proof she had kept, because her grandmother had taught her to keep records as a matter of honor, and a translator could read it to the judge in 3 weeks, and the cut on Hetty's arm would be in the ground with her, but the book wouldn't. The mystery box was open now, at least between the two of them. The culprit had a shape, even if he didn't yet have a name in Suzu's mouth. Tucker said they needed the book out of Holt's office before the Caros decided to make it disappear, and he said it the way he said everything, like a problem he was already measuring for fence posts. The ground had shifted under the whole story. She wasn't a disgraced woman hiding anymore. She was a witness, and she had the record to prove it, and the only thing standing between her and the truth was a weak sheriff, a powerful family, and one man in that valley who couldn't afford to let her live long enough to say any of it out loud. The man's name was Boyd Marsh, and he was the foreman of the Caro Ranch. Crawl. Wall. Suzu had seen him a dozen times in Bitter Springs, a tall man with an easy smile who tipped his hat to every woman on the street and kept Walt Caro's books and Walt Caro's confidence in equal measure. She had never treated him, and she had never thought about him, and that was the way he had wanted it. Boyd wasn't a villain out of a dime novel. He was a frightened man who had built a whole life on top of one lie, and the lie was that Hetty Caro's affections were his alone, and the lie had cracked the night Hetty cut her arm on the buckle of his belt in the back of his buckboard and bled all the way home. He had spent the weeks since then holding the crack shut with both hands, and then Suzu's name came up at the general store, alive and sheltered at Crow Creek, and he felt the crack widen. He didn't ride out to threaten her. He rode out to buy her. He came up the drive on a Sunday afternoon, alone, well-dressed, with a roll of cash, in his saddlebag big enough to start a life in San Francisco. He sat on the porch, with Suzu and Tucker standing, and he offered it to her as kindness. He said he was sorry for what the town had done to her, that he had always thought well of her work, and that a woman of her skill deserved a fresh start in a place that would appreciate her. He slid the roll across the porch rail between them. Suzu looked at the money. She looked at Boyd. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain herself. She said one word: no. And she picked the roll up off the rail and set it back on the bench beside him, and she went inside and closed the door. And Tucker stayed on the porch until Boyd understood he was being watched and rode away. Boyd understood then that she wouldn't run, which meant she would talk, which meant the only way to keep the crack shut was to make it impossible for her to stay. He couldn't do it himself, because a foreman who rides out and burns a hermit's cabin is a man the county asks questions about. But a town that rides out to deal with a poisoner is a different story, and Boyd knew how to light that fire, because he had lit one like it before, years back, county to the south, and it had worked. He went to Walt Caro and told him the poisoner was hiding at Crow Creek, that the hermit had taken up with her, and that the town's honor was going to look weak if they let a foreign woman who'd killed Walt's wife live openly protected 3 miles from the Caro fence line. He said it, careful, the way a man feeds a flame, and Walt Caro, who was already half mad with grief and whiskey, gave him the men and the horses and the nod. The riders would come at dawn. 8 of them, with rope and a keg of coal, oil, and Boyd among them, but not at their head, because the man who lights a mob never rides at its front. Suzu knew they were coming before Tucker told her, because she had seen the look on Boyd's face when she closed the door on his money, and she knew what a frightened man does when you take his last clean exit away. That night, Suzu did something Tucker didn't expect. She went to her cloth roll, the one she kept hidden in the lining of her coat, and from the bottom of it she took out a long wrapped object he had never seen, longer than the roll itself, wrapped in oiled silk. She set it on the kitchen table and unwound the silk, and inside was a naginata, a pole blade, as long as she was tall, the haft dark with age, and the curved steel at the end still bright where the silk had kept the air off it. Tucker stared at it. He hadn't known she carried it. He had assumed the needles were the extent of what she had brought out of Kyoto, and he had been wrong about her twice now, and he was starting to understand that being wrong about Suzu was going to be a habit. She told him she wasn't going to kill anyone. She told him the blade was for stopping, not for ending, the way her grandmother had trained her in the courtyard above the laundry in San Francisco. Hours of footwork and forms before she was ever allowed to touch the steel, because a woman with a blade and no discipline is just a danger, and her grandmother hadn't raised her to be a danger. She had raised her to be a wall when a wall was needed. Tucker told her, flat, that they couldn't win a fight against 8 men with a rifle and a polearm between them. She agreed. She said they didn't have to win. She said they had to stand long enough for one man in that crowd to remember he wasn't a killer, and then the rest of them would follow that one man home, because a mob is only as brave as its bravest man and only as decent as its decentest, and if the decent one breaks first, the whole thing comes apart. Tucker asked her how she could possibly know there was a decent one in that crowd. She said she had watched that town for a year, and only one person in it had ever looked at her the way a person looks at another person, instead of the way a town looks at a thing, and that person would be in the crowd tonight, because the town would call him up, and when the moment came, he would be the one she aimed her stand at. This was the moral heart of the whole story, though neither of them said it in those words. Tucker had opened his door to her on a night he should have left it shut, betting his solitude on a stranger. Now she was betting her life on a single decent man in a mob, the same kind of bet, made in the same faith, that 1 person in 100 will look at you instead of through you. She was asking Tucker to trust that the way Tucker had asked her to trust the spare room. They banked the lamp. They moved the table against the door. Tucker oiled the rifle and set it by the window where the morning light would come first. Suzu stood the naginata by the doorframe and checked the wrap on the haft with her fingers, the way her grandmother had taught her a prayer that wasn't words. Then they sat in the dark and waited for the sky to lighten, and the only sound was the creak outside and their own breathing, and the night was very long. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. Dawn came gray and cold, with a mist on the creek and the grass wet enough to darken the horses' legs as they came up the drive. 8 riders, just as she had said, and Boyd among them. But at the back, the way she had said that too. Tucker saw him back there and understood for the first time that she had read that man down to the grain, and he was glad he hadn't been the one she was reading. Tucker stepped out first, the rifle low across his body, not raised, because a raised rifle is a declaration, and he wasn't ready to declare anything yet. Then Suzu stepped out behind him, and the naginata came with her, and the long blade caught the first real light of the morning, and threw it back at the riders in a thin white line. The riders stalked. None of them had expected an armed woman who didn't look afraid, and none of them had expected her to look like that, standing straight with the pole planted, and her hands set on the haft, the way a person stands who has done this before and isn't pretending. The horses shifted, the men didn't. The confrontation wasn't a battle, it was a held silence, the kind that weighs more than a shout, and it stretched out across the wet grass until Suzu broke it. She spoke once, in English, slow enough that every man on that line could follow, and her voice didn't shake. She told them Hetty Caro died of a wound she had hidden from her husband, a wound on her arm a week old, and not of any medicine Suzu had given her. She told them the proof was in her grandmother's record book, the one the sheriff had locked in his office, written the night she dressed the cut, and that the circuit judge was 3 weeks out and could read it with a translator. She didn't name Boyd Marsh. She didn't point at him. She looked at him once, across the heads of the men in front, and she let him see that she was leaving his life in the hands of the men around him and not in hers, and that was a worse threat than any name could have been. Then she was quiet, and the silence came back, and the men on the line looked at each other, and the mob began to do what mobs do, which is search for the one person who will move first, so the rest of them can follow or not follow. The one who moved first was Finn, the clerk from the general store, the young man who had noticed Tucker buying for 2, and who had a year ago been the only person in Bitter Springs to ask Suzu how to say thank you in Japanese when she set his mother's broken wrist. He was there because the town had called him up, and he was the one Suzu had been aiming her stand at all along. He lowered his rifle, slow, and he said flat that he would ride to the county seat himself that morning and bring the judge back early, and that any man who touched the woman or the rancher before that judge arrived was going to answer to him and to the law he was riding for. The mob broke the way she had said it would. The men turned their horses, 1, and then 3, and then the rest, and they went back down the drive in the wet grass, and Boyd went with them alone at the back, and she didn't watch him go, because watching him go would have been the same as giving him her attention, and she was done giving him anything. Tucker didn't say anything heroic in the quiet. After. He stood on the porch with the rifle still low, and he looked at her, and he said one line, spoken this time, not as a lie the way a man says it to save a stranger, but as a fact he was choosing to make true. She stays. She's mine to look after. Heard it. She didn't correct him. She set the naginata's butt down on the porch boards and let her hands rest on the haft, and that was her answer, and it was enough, and the morning opened up around them, and the mist on the creek started to lift. That evening, she opened the lacquered box at last. She set her grandmother's record book on the kitchen table between them, and she lit the lamp, and the amber light came up steady in the small room, and the door stood unlocked for the first time in years. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels.